Hello friends, today I'm going to talk about a very important topic, and that is about environment. We all know that because of the environment pollution, we are expecting a rise in temperature, and due to that increase in temperature, we are expecting glaciers to be melted that could increase the sea level, and as a result, we would expect more floods, more forest fires, and diseases afterward. Among the GHG, which is known as greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is the main contributor, which constitute around over 80% of the total greenhouse gases. And we all know that CO2 emissions are the result of our industrial activities. At present, the top 10 countries are China, USA, India, Russia, Japan, Germany, Korea, Iran, Canada, and Saudi Arabia. In total, we have 32.8 billion tons of CO2 emission in 2017, and that was recorded by the Energy Agency, worldwide agency. But if you look into China, the share of China is more than 28% of this total CO2 emissions, with 9.3 billion tons of CO2. USA is close to 15% with 4.8 billion tons of CO2 emissions. India 2.2% or about 7% of the total world CO2 emissions. Russia is about 1.5 billion tons or about 5% share. So if we look at only the top 4 countries, China, USA, India, and Russia, in total their share in the world emission of carbon dioxide is over 55%. So the question comes that should we blame China, USA, India, or Russia? Should we ask these countries to reduce their CO2 emissions? But then when we look at these countries, all these countries offer a different explanation about their emissions. Some countries say that, we have CO2 emissions, but this CO2 emission is quite small in terms of if per person living in that country. Other countries, they say, we have very low CO2 emissions because whatever the number of dollars we produce in our country, compared to that, the emission is very low. So there are a number of explanations from each country. We are going to see how those explanations work. So before we move on, please subscribe this channel and press the bell button so that you could be notified for new videos. And your subscription and your comments, please provide us your comments. How do you think about this video, or if you want any other interesting topics that you want to hear about. So please keep commenting and liking this video, and let's go to the next level. Okay, so when we compare carbon dioxide emissions relative to the population of the country, we find a very different picture. And that picture supports the statements of many highly populated countries like China and India, who say that, relative to their population, their emission is very low, so they should not be asked to reduce the CO2 emissions. Rather, countries like Saudi Arabia, Australia, Canada, and US and Russia, they should take action and should reduce their CO2 emissions. So look at this chart. Saudi Arabia was number 10 in the previous chart, and in terms of total tons of CO2 emissions, but here it becomes the top emitting country when we compared its total emission relative to its population. Australia was not even in the top 10 countries in terms of emission of CO2 emissions, but here it becomes the second top country with 15.6 tons of CO2 emissions per person. Canada was number 9, but now it's top third country, and Russia dropped its position from the second top country in terms of CO2 emissions to 14.6 tons of CO2 emissions and number 4 ranking. And interestingly, India disappears. India has no more any place in top 10 countries when compared with its population, and China drops to the number 10 compared to its population with only 6.7 tons of emissions per person. So here is the statement from China and India and other highly populated countries that they say, oh, the countries they have more or less population and they create more emissions, they should do something, not us. The counter argument that comes from advanced countries, high income countries, they say, oh, emissions should not be looked in relative to the population, but actually emissions should be looked into with reference to the number of dollars produced in the country, because CO2 is the outcome of industrial activities. So what is the income of the country? So what we did, we just divided total tons of CO2 emissions by the national income, like total income of the country. So we wanted to know what is the level of CO2 emissions per dollar produced in a country. Picture completely changed. China gained is number 4. So from number 10, China is number 4 ranking. So it has 0.9 kilogram of CO2 emissions for each dollar produced in China. Russia takes number 3, like a third ranking, with same around 0.9 kilogram of CO2 emissions per dollar produced. But other countries like Iran and South Africa becomes top 2 countries, and they were not even the top 10 countries in the previous slide. Like South Africa was not there, but now in terms of dollars, South Africa is number 2 countries. So another interesting point is that where is Canada and USA? Canada and USA disappeared. So they say, oh, we are not even in the top 10 countries when we compare our level of emissions relative to our income that we produce. So it's not US and Canada or other rich countries who should work for reducing their CO2 emission. It should be China and India, because they are they are committing or they are emitting more CO2, and also they in terms of dollars, what for producing $1 worth of goods in their country, they are producing almost 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide emissions. So there is an issue coming there as well. Climatic conditions are also used as a reason for higher emissions by some countries. Colder countries like Russia and Canada may argue that in the winter time their temperature drops to minus 30, minus 40, so they need to keep their houses heated, they need to keep their buildings, workplaces, malls heated, and that's why they need more energy, and when they use more energy, there's more emission. On the other hand, hot countries like Saudi Arabia, or even to some extent to USA, they can argue that because of high summer, severe summer, we have to keep our buildings cold, so we have higher cooling requirements. And when we want to cool our workplaces, living areas, and all those places, we have to use more energy, and that's why we are having more emissions. So this is our other argument related with this CO2 emission. And finally, some countries argue that if they are large countries, their area is very big, like Canada, Russia, or US, or Australia. Because they are large countries, the distances between the cities and between the places is too big, and in order to travel from point A to point B, they need to use transportation which is used for a longer time period, and that's why they have higher emission level. Or in other words, some advanced countries, they say their living standard is high because they have so many cars, and when they have more cars, they are a reason for higher emissions. Okay, so what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that there are a number of arguments. Each country can make any argument in favor of its own interests. China can argue about the population and get out of CO2 emission stock. USA can make an argument about income level and get out of the emission talk. What or Russia? Russia can take the argument about temperature and the distance and say, oh, okay, that's why they have higher emission. But the question is a global issue. Please, all countries come together. Put your differences aside. Don't think in terms of population or in terms of per capita or the distance or temperature or any other reasons for your emissions. Recognize that this is an issue and please do something. I will urge all countries, our politicians, please come together and work together to reduce CO2 emissions. Thank you very much for watching this video.